Welcome to another episode of Me in the Kitchen, where we are going to talk about psychology and attachment and narcissism while I make the TikTok viral feta tomato pasta recipe. I'm not normally a huge pasta fan just because of the gluten situation with my autoimmune, but this recipe has looked so good for so long. So if you're on TikTok, you're going to be over this, but if you actually don't spend time on TikTok, this might be new to you. It is basically a recipe involving a deep dish pan, cherry tomatoes, and you basically cover them in olive oil, salt and pepper. You put a block of feta cheese in the center and you drizzle that with olive oil, salt and pepper, and a few other spices and herbs maybe. You toss it in the oven, you bake it for a while, and you basically mix it with some kind of pasta. I've got penne right here, and I may put it over rice, I haven't decided, and I may add some shrimp. Either way, I will show you the videos. Basically, it seems like a really easy way to have a creamy, tomatoey, yummy kind of dinner. So I'll let you know how it tastes. I've actually never tried it. So what we're going to talk about today, though, is narcissism in a primary caregiver, which is most often mothers historically, though it can be anyone. And when they have a more anxious attachment style, how that can impact you as their child as you become an adult. We're also going to talk in other videos about avoidance and narcissism as a caregiver, and then disorganized. And so stick around or check those out maybe later this week. I'll be adding those in. I want to go into this impact because I think that so many of us are really struggling with the way we grew up and what we thought loved looked like. And because it is very true that even though we often talk badly about a lot of these disorders, the real texture and flavor of human beings isn't like the Wicked Witch of the West for most people. It absolutely can be. But I think where it gets confusing is that for different reasons and different types of issues, it's not always bad. And so we have all these parts of this really attachment trauma from these parental wounds that we've absorbed that we think are really who we are. And so I want to kind of break that down to help you understand where some of these patterns may have come from, and hopefully thereby giving you the power to think about ways you can enhance, heal, and change those dynamics. So I'm going to start making the pasta and the tomatoes as we talk, and we will keep going. All right, so when you have a parent who has a more narcissistic kind of bent to who they are, basically what we're talking about is emerging from childhood with some pretty significant wounds around worthiness, around your own lovability, around feeling like love is conditional, right? So it's like love has to be earned, it has to be seen. In a family with multiple children, only one person can be the most special at any given time. Things like that. And also like a deep sense of emptiness and almost a guilt for even existing, which is a common phrase of those raised by narcissistic parents. And I will get to narcissistic fathers specifically because I do think it's important. It's just been one of those things where I've been trying to figure out how to kind of break down these issues, because let's say your mother was not narcissistic, but your father was, in a classic, or the other partner, let's just say partner one, partner two, we do have impacts from secondary and tertiary or third types of attachment influences, like the other parent, grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings, even bullying, social dynamics, things like that. So it is important to know that those things are impactful, but what I'm talking about is your kind of base of primary attachment impact, right? When you're really little, like under the age of 3 for the most part, 3 to 4, 5 max. All of that can be impactful. And certainly traumas can change those things. You could have a very, I just saw a cat try to attack the birds on my patio. You can have like a parent who was pretty secure, and then they could have a loss, and that could significantly change the way they were able to show up for you. So it is much more complicated. I find these like categories of like, it's just this, it's just attachment, it's just anxious, it's just avoidant, to not be very helpful. So I like to think about them as parts and as colors ideally, and we'll talk more about that in another video. As I get closer to releasing my attachment course, I really want to explain that. But basically when I talk about the parts, what I'm saying is that when I was saying how you can have a parent who isn't always bad, there's a part of you that feels good, that attaches to a part of them when they are good or being kind or loving. And there's a part of them that can be really, let's say, vindictive and unkind and hateful. And so that part also lives in you. So that's why I think it's important to break it down. I think it helps us understand it from a much more nuanced experience. Okay, so I just talked about what it looks like, right? So we have these typical impacts of like unchecked, untreated, undiagnosed primary caregivers with narcissism. Then we look at, well, what happens with a more classic anxious attachment style? What does it look like for us? And then we're going to talk about the parenting behaviors. That's what I really want to get into today. And so as an anxious person, you're always trying to like, when am I going to get the love? What is it going to take for the love? You're going to have things like wanting a lot of closeness, wanting intimacy, but being terrified of losing it. Being afraid of little things causing issues, so you overread, and we're going to talk about that role of hypervigilance in a minute. Over focusing on relationships, always suspicious your partner's going to leave you or cheat on you. And I'm also missing nails, so we're just going to go with it. I can't get them done till this weekend, and at this point I feel like we know each other well enough that you're not going to judge me, hopefully. Okay, so letting others have control of relational dynamics. So basically, if I'm anxious and we're in a relationship, I'm more looking for you to set the tone. Like, are we going to be exclusive or not? Things like that. Feeling like I can't always express what I'm feeling, but a lot of stress and anxiety inside. And so I might play games to check in and see, like, do you really care about me? Are you going to be there for me? Things like that. Now, how does that classic attachment, what we think of as adult attachment behaviors, how does that tie into what happens in a narcissistic parent who also has more anxious attachment? So while I'm doing that, I'm going to put the feta in here and let's get into that. Actually, I want to say this really quickly because I put this in my notes. I don't know that I need to go into what a narcissistic parent looks like. But I think if I was going to summarize it, it really is about parents who are conditional, controlling, focused on the outside, lack empathy, often will, make you doubt your own reality, don't know how to have true connection. Connection has to be earned, who can be very harsh and critical, a lot of rage and anger, or a very victim-y, internalized type parent. A parent who might look like the head of the PTA and is so giving and what we call a communal narcissist, and really what they're doing is trying to get all that attention and sense of self built from look how great I am. So we all know, most of you who watch my channel, I know because I see the analytics that I don't watch them very well, and more than I should. I probably should do it better. But I know that many of you watch like Dr. Ramani, who's amazing, and a lot of other creators who talk about narcissism. And so I feel like most of you kind of know what a narcissistic parent looks like, but just to say that. Okay, so let's get into what the main issues are when we're talking about attachment in a more anxious presentation when it comes to the actual mothering, caregiving types of behaviors. Okay, so when we talk about that, and this is the, I've never tried this kind before, this is the Greek feta I'm going to use. When we talk about anxious attachment in general, what we're talking about are a couple of main issues. Number one, we're talking about caregivers who were not great at timing. So they were sometimes there, sometimes not there. And when they tried to attune, they often missed it, right? It may have been because they were, had their own mental health issues. They were depressed. They were at work all day. There's a lot of reasons why we can see the inconsistency. So, but part of it is what we know is a consistent kind of lack of consistent responsiveness in a way that we can say like, oh, I kind of know my parent will be this way in this situation. It's a little bit like, okay, it can just be kind of all over the map, not necessarily chaotic and unsafe like in a more disorganized pattern, but in the sort of predictability dynamic. Okay, I just drained my feta cheese. Okay, so what we're talking about are, like I'm saying, a lack of predictability. And I got a little distracted there. And then the next thing that is, I don't think talked about enough when we look at some of the research on attachment around anxiousness, are parents who basically, I think I say basically a lot, who basically over-involve their children in their state of mind. And so I've talked about this a lot in other videos. Let me grab some salt and some pepper. But what happens is, because of their own anxieties, they often spill over into the child's exposure. So the parents often have a lot of their own anxiety, a lot of fear. There's not as good of a boundary between what the child is exposed to in terms of the parent's emotions. And so the children learn to be outside-in orientators, right? So they learn that I have to be more hypervigilant and focused on what you need in order to get my own needs met. And that becomes the baseline often for anxiousness, which is I look to you to set the tone, to read your face, your mood, your mind, whatever it is, and that determines how I respond. And it also can put us in parentification roles, obviously enmeshment dynamics, where what we're really doing is trying to regulate ourselves by looking at how other people are responding. And so that other people initially is our caregiver, our primary caregiver. So we go out into the world expecting that our job is to overread, overthink others. And what that does is, it obviously creates often compulsive caretaking behaviors, including our own parents, right, or others. And we get rewarded for that. Oh, you're so helpful, you're so kind, you're so mature, you're so blah, blah, blah. And, you're a great big sister, big brother, whatever, big sibling. And it also helps us numb our own pain of our own attachment wounds not being met. So when that's happening, and you have a narcissistically inclined parent who is more anxious, what we're often going to see is a lot of really controlling behaviors. Now, we know that parental over-control is actually more common in anxious attachment, right? So what they're trying to do is mitigate their own anxiety by over-controlling at times for kids. And that, of course, as we know, can impact our sense of autonomy, sorry for that noise, and independence, and our exploratory behaviors. Because part of the attachment theory says, actually, the more secure we are, the more stable our environment is, the more likely we are to go out in the world and explore the world, knowing that we can always go back to the safety of the nest, basically, right? So if you have a narcissistic parent, you have a lot of control issues, even more so. A lot of conditionality, which is when you do what I want you to do and that calms my anxiety, then I'm going to give you more love and more reward. So you learn to kind of eggshell also in response to that. We know that those over-controlling behaviors, I want to read this to you. It says, in contrast, parents of anxious compared to non-anxious youth have been consistently found to use a greater degree of over-control, suggesting that regardless of parental anxiety status, the use of parental over-control appears related to higher levels of anxiety in children. So, right, that's affecting their anxiety, the parents, and it's affecting our anxiety. So now we have more anxiety all the way around, which is also going to be more triggering. So if your child is more emotional, more anxious, they might be more likely to have meltdowns, to cry more, to get angry more, to slam their doors, to smash their toys, to kick their sibling. Now that can be for lots of other reasons as well, in terms of, like, let's say ADHD or their own mental health issues. I'm talking about like impulsivity with ADHD. But the bottom line is that that is going to be a trigger for a narcissistic parent who now we know lacks empathy, is more easily prone to bursts of anger and rage, and is going to already be anxious themselves. So you can see how that like combination starts to become even more damaging for kids. What else do we see? We see that the timing and the lack of predictability, like I said, is an issue. And so when you're narcissistic, you don't have great self-awareness. And so you see that when you want to attune to your child, when you decide to be mommy, daddy, parent, that is when you're going to do that. And it doesn't really matter. So the child's reaching out and behaviors trying to like tell you, hey, I don't like this, or this hurts me, are going to be even less likely to be seen and acknowledged, and even more likely to be diminished, minimized, mocked, and things like that. And so now we're talking about how the selfishness really of often narcissism is even more likely to pull you away. So one example is in anxious research. It showed that the anxious parents are more likely to be overly multitasking. So as I've said in other videos, they have like a baby on the hip, they're on the phone, they're doing the dishes, which, I mean, I've done all these things. Most of us as parents have to multitask. So we're not talking about shaming that. We're talking about a pattern of you consistently, rarely ever having one-on-one, face-to-face connected time. And that can be just a part of being a parent, right? And we add in like multiple children, or having your unlimited resources, or being a single parent. Like all these things are going to happen even more, even when you don't want them to. But the point is that with a narcissistic bent to the anxiousness, it's going to make it even less likely that the parent is ever really, truly attuning and mirroring you. In fact, if they're truly narcissistic, I believe you never truly feel seen by them, because they really can't see you as they see their own reflection in your eyes back to them. That is the version of mommy they want to see or will see. You know, I've heard so many narcissistic parents, you know, people say to me, they swear they're a great, like they really believe it, that they were a great parent. They did their best, and you know, they really were, and it's like, no, you were like terrible. What are you talking about? But then you can't even give them feedback, even if you said it in a kind way, because they have no room for that. So now we're talking about anxiety mixed with minimization of who you are, and that flashing back to the selfishness of the parent. And then we talk about selective attunement, right? So all parents can struggle with this at some point. Well, we're never going to attune anywhere near perfectly. I think it's somewhere around, if we get it right, like 70% of the time, we're more likely to be in a more stable, secure situation. But when you look at the root of narcissism and how easily triggered they can be, that means you have a parent who's like actively walking around with their own triggers. And now, because of their anxiety, that if they're more anxious, you have learned to be hyper vigilant on reading, attuning, and pleasing the narcissistic parent. And so now your baseline, not just for human beings as a caregiver, but your baseline is narcissistic people, right? That is what you know. And that can often cause a lot of issues for you, being more likely to go out in the world and unconsciously choose those same kinds of partners. So I just realized there are 2 bricks of feta in here, and I'm not sure it needs both, but I'm gonna do it. All right, so we know that fear and anxious attachment is something the parents feel a lot more often. They often will be really good at parenting fear. Oh, don't touch that, and then baby responds, and then they get this like reciprocity. So what can happen is the child learns that when mommy is afraid, there's some kind of bond that occurs between us, because that's when they often feel really competent as parents. They're good at those kinds of things. So you add the narcissistic piece to it. It can be very conditional about what's safe and not safe. So absolutely neglecting a child in some areas where they should be paying attention because they're more focused on something else. And other places just like overdoing it, right? So this narcissistic bent really can add another layer to this need to be hypervigilant and overread the parents. And then the last part of this, I think I should just I think I've done full videos, but I'll do even more on these explicit parenting styles, is the piece I said, an over-involvement in the parent's state of mind, the hypervigilance. So with narcissists who are often, will make a child their best friend, their therapist, and they complain about their partner, their ex, whatever it is, be vindictive, expose the child to all of that stuff. Now the child is living and swimming in that narcissistic emotion, that, poor me, that rage, that I'm so perfect, it's all about me. And so we're shaping a child more and more like the ocean with the rocks situation, right? The shoreline, more and more to think that my job is to kind of rotate around other people. And if my norm is a narcissistic parent, I have this like combined feeling of never feeling seen, but desperately wanting to. And feeling like the caregiving behaviors and the compulsiveness around that, at least that's how I got my needs met. So if I, was able to make this narcissistic parent feel even more special, and I did get a little bit of, I've talked about good love, then I'm more likely to kind of go out in the world and do the same thing, like I'm saying. So that is really what we're talking about when you think about the layer of narcissistic parents and how they can really set us up to feel never really seen, but to live in this belief that if we just love them more or do more of the things that they need and be the best friend and the therapist or get the grades and all those things, that they will finally see us. But because of the narcissism, number one, they're never going to be able to do that. That is just how it's going to be if it's a truly narcissistic human being. And our anxiety, that anxious attachment piece, has taught us that we can't count on people. They might always leave us. They might abandon us. We have to do things to get love in return. And then we often have this deeply wounded, unlovable, unworthy, like I said, going back to the beginning, a sense of self that is a whole other layer from just anxious. It is almost like depleted inside. And so we go out in the world oftentimes and try to do all the things to get the love ourselves from our own overachievement and being super critical, perfectionistic, all kinds of other disorders that can, from a mental health perspective, plague us because of that. So that is really the bottom line. And lastly, don't forget that all of this also affects exploratory play, meaning that your willingness to take risks in the world is also reduced the more likely you have a narcissistic parent, the more likely you are with an anxious parent. And then you have the narcissistic piece, which literally may tell you like, well, you can't do that. Like, who do you think you are? Like, what's wrong with you? And they might not even be that overt, though they absolutely may. But the message is, I'm the one that shines. Who do you think you are? You're nothing without me. I've sacrificed everything for you. The very common response is, what is with the parent, when people try to talk to their parents and they say, I did the best I could. I'm the worst parent ever. They have a really hard time owning and repairing. So when you try to do the work on your own attachment style and set boundaries and kind of build your internal sense of self, and you think you can talk to them and work them through it, and they're going to own their behavior and make repairs, and then you hit this wall of active rejection, it can be incredibly painful. And I think it's often the reason why people end up going no contact is because they realize all of this, they try to make the repair, and for many parents, they're just absolutely unwilling to look at their own behavior. And that would definitely be true for a more textbook narcissistic parent, regardless of what flavor of narcissism they kind of meet. So that's today's video. I want to show you my little pan here with my feta and olive oil. I'll use my iPhone and show you some more pictures. I'm going to put this with a little bit of garlic and a few more herbs and pop it in the oven, and then I will come back and show you later on my iPhone video what it looks like. So thanks for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.